Hello, everybody. Come to the front, as we always do in press conferences. None of us are going to breathe on you from the podium. We are safe. We are safe participants. And on a very hot day, so proving the whole point about global warming and emissions, perhaps. I am Ian Williams, the president of the Foreign Press Association here in New York, and it gives us a great deal of pleasure to get to Dr. Robert Howarth from Cornell, who is through a sort of, it's older googly, I think it's saying, cricket, I'm not sure what a curveball in baseball, by introducing the idea that all hydrogen is not good hydrogen. And we often see people peddling solutions. We dealt recently with people who were for and against the idea that nuclear power was a solution to carbon-free emissions. And in this particular paper that Dr. Robert Howarth produced, he examined the question of blue hydrogen as opposed to green hydrogen. And then I read his paper and discovered there was also gray hydrogen and brown hydrogen. So, I mean, who knew? As a high school chemist, I was always told odorless, flavorless, colorless. And here I discover a whole spectrum of hydrogen. So please, Robert, explain to us the different colors of hydrogen. The colorless
Absolutely. Gas. It's a fascinating topic area. Blue hydrogen, I'll get to exactly what blue hydrogen is in a minute, but I started thinking about blue hydrogen about a year ago. I'm on the commission set up by New York state law to come up with an implementation plan to drive our state to carbon neutrality. It's called the Climate Action Council. And about a year ago, we started hearing from people that we should be considering blue hydrogen as a major part of our planning. At the time, I hadn't heard of blue hydrogen, so I got curious and started looking into it. And so turns out that the term blue hydrogen is pretty recent. It was first coined by a French gas company just 6 years ago, and really only came into mainstream parlance in the last 3 or 4 years. The Hydrogen Council, which was set up by BP, Shell, and Total back in 2017.
That's a telling point, sorry.
Well, the Hydrogen Council, it's funded by those three, right? Yes. And it was set up in 2017 for the first time, and much of what you hear about blue hydrogen is coming from them. That's a major job of the Hydrogen Council. So let's talk a little bit first about hydrogen. Today, 96% of the hydrogen in the world comes from fossil fuels. And if you're in China, it's largely coal. The rest of the world, certainly all of Europe and the United States, it's coming from natural gas. And the process is to take, natural gas is mostly methane. You take the methane that's in natural gas and you put it under high heat, high pressure, you add a little steam, it's called steam methane reforming, and the methane dissociates into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And industry's been doing this for over 110, 120 years. It's old technology, but that's 96% of where hydrogen's coming from. We call that gray hydrogen. It's pretty dirty. Everyone agrees it's dirty. You've got the carbon dioxide that comes from the dissociation of the methane, and you're just tossing that off into the air, but you're also burning a large amount of natural gas to provide that heat and pressure to drive the whole process. So there's more carbon dioxide there. And then again, natural gas is mostly methane, and you can't really develop and process methane without having some of it emitted unburned to the atmosphere before it even reaches your facility. And methane as a greenhouse gas is more than 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, so those small emissions matter. Anyway, that gray hydrogen, that the traditional hydrogen is very, very dirty. Blue hydrogen, coming out of the Hydrogen Council, is the idea that they will capture the carbon dioxide that's emitted when the methane dissociates into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And that sounds great. They call it, depending on which press release or report you read when, they call it either zero emissions or low emissions. Turns out there's very, very little literature on that. So I started working on a full analysis of the greenhouse gas footprint of this about 9 months ago. And I brought in Mark Jacobson, an engineer from Stanford, to help me, particularly in the carbon capture, because that's not my area of expertise. I work more on methane emissions. But we published our paper. It's the first peer-reviewed paper that looks at the complete life cycle emissions of blue hydrogen, and we published it earlier this month, just a few weeks ago. The bottom line is that there are only 2 commercial plants ever that have tried to do this blue hydrogen. They do have publicly available data on what their emissions capture is. One of them was funded by the US Department of Energy, so the data are publicly available. The other is a private plant in Alberta, Canada, but the Alberta government requires the data. So we used the data from those 2 plants. So far, they've made no effort to even try to capture the carbon dioxide from the combustion of the gas, only from the dissociation of the gas. And they get about 80 to 85% of that. So they're still emitting some of that, plus all of the carbon dioxide that is powering the whole process.
So when this gas hits the household, it's not pure hydrogen, it's a mixture of methane and hydrogen? Or?
Yeah, no, it comes through as pure hydrogen, but it's released a lot of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in making it, is the bottom line. More than you might have thought. You know, this gray hydrogen, the traditional stuff that everyone agrees is dirty, releases somewhat more carbon dioxide emissions than blue hydrogen, but not a huge amount. And the blue hydrogen actually emits more methane because it also takes energy to power the carbon capture. And that takes, you're burning more natural gas to power that and methane. When you add it all up, we estimate that the blue hydrogen has a greenhouse gas footprint that's about 10% better than the very, very dirty stuff. But it actually turns out to have a bigger greenhouse gas footprint than if you simply burned natural gas. That's our strong conclusion.
And the attraction, I mean, the marketing attraction of hydrogen is it's odorless, it's colorless, and combustion product on a pure chemistry from my high school days is water when you burn it.
It sounds great, you know, and it's if you take green hydrogen comes from the electrolysis of water. And if you use 100% renewable electricity for that, then the footprint is really, really low. And that undoubtedly should play a role in our decarbonized energy future. To me, you know, it seems calling this other fossil fuel derived carbon blue hydrogen, it's a marketing term, right? Blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, it all sounds good.
Sacre bleu, the French invented it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not clean. It's a dirty, dirty hydrogen.
Well, I suppose dirty movies, blue hydrogen.
Well,
there's
there you go. I don't think that's what the marketers had in mind.
Well, it might get customers. I mean, it sells.
Right.
I'm not sure they call them blue movies anymore, though. I'm showing my age here on my linguistic, historical linguistic abilities. But with the chemistry, what's the attraction for the? I mean, is this the same old New York fracking lobby trying to repeddle their wares in a green way, or is it?
I'm the first author of the first ever peer-reviewed paper on why methane emissions from shale gas from fracking is probably a bad idea for climate. We published that back in April of 2011, so just over 10 years ago. And I must say that this story has a very, very similar ring to it. People were marketing shale gases as having a lower emission than was true because they were ignoring methane. And there's a lot of marketing going on here.
And well, I mean, also because the fracking lobby in New York State in particular has a well-established apparatus. They know where the politicians' pockets are, and they know how to reach them.
Yeah, well, it's not just the United States. You know, our paper came out on the 12th of August, pretty recently. And I knew that I would be making some people in industry unhappy because this is clearly a major marketing play, right? We wrote a very conservative paper. We have only 4 core assumptions in it, and we ran detailed sensitivity analyses on those across a wide range of assumptions. And our conclusions are amazingly robust. And we purposefully made it robust because I expected pushback and irritated people in industry. What I didn't understand or anticipate was that this blue hydrogen idea, it has some legs in the US moving forward. Certainly, they'd like us to use it in New York as part of our decarbonization. I don't think that's likely to happen. Certainly not. They're not getting my vote on the council anyway. There is some language in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed the Senate earlier this month to support blue hydrogen. There's definitely legislation for various subsidies in the European Union, but the big news of the month is that 5 days after our report came out, the United Kingdom issued their first major up plan on energy plan, how the UK is going to meet the Paris COP21 goals in the future by 2050. And blue hydrogen is front and central. They assume that it really is zero emissions, and that by moving to this fuel, the United Kingdom is going to be carbon free by 2050. So, they've been working on that for 2 years. It came out 5 days after our report, and there are an awful lot of people who are working on that plan who are very, very unhappy with Mark Jacobson and I at the moment.
Well, I know near my home area, near Liverpool, there were actual earthquakes attributed to the fracking activities there in the shale. So, I mean, quite apart from the carbon emissions, so we had other horsemen of the apocalypse galloping through the area. So it does not have a very good name. But on the other hand, the UK government is much more economical than the British government. There's only one set of pockets to be stuffed in the national government instead of all the state governments.
I don't know if it's corrupt or not. I presume that some of the people who were associated with the report thought it was a good idea. Although I will point out that our paper came out on the 12th. 5 days later, the UK plan comes out with blue hydrogen front and central. And another day after that, the executive director of the trade group for hydrogen and fuel cells in the United Kingdom resigned. And he specifically said his life work had been in green hydrogen, the electrolysis, the truly carbon-free work. But he'd gotten caught up in trying to promote this blue hydrogen thing that industry had been pushing, and it was a sham, and he couldn't do it anymore. So it's
wow, a person of integrity. Does he get is there a Nobel Prize for integrity?
Well, I appreciated the timing of his standing up, because it came right as we were getting this pushback and going, no, some on the inside agree with us.
Well, let's take it through the cycle. I mean, there's a lot more attention to methane now, and especially with the Arctic burning, even without the methane in it. There's the under ocean, the suboceanic clathrates, are they called?
The methane clathrates, yes.
Yes, which is sort of almost methane ice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a water hydrogen crystalline form. Yeah, under pressure.
And it's evaporating into bubbles.
Well, it is, and people started. Jim Hansen wrote a paper back in 2008, warning that as we warmed the planet, we might melt some of these methane clathrates. They're massive stores of methane in it. I certainly worried about it for a while. I'm still worried about it, but I'm not as worried as I was. People have been looking pretty closely at it, and some of those methane hydrates are melting, but there's no evidence that they're melting more than they were earlier. And at least so far, where we observe the methane clathrates melting, the methane doesn't seem to be reaching the surface. You can observe this with sonar. It's methane bubbles, and you can watch the sonar coming up, and the plumes aren't reaching the surface. The gas dissolves out of the bubbles into the water. And once it's dissolved in the seawater, bacteria will decompose it. So far, it's not getting to the atmosphere. Now, if we continue to warm the planet faster and faster and faster, then the clathrates might melt faster, and that would give you bigger bubbles, which are more likely to reach the atmosphere. So still a reason of concern, but so far it doesn't seem to be a driver of what we're seeing for atmospheric methane.
Well, these models take account of the sort of tipping points, the cataclysmic. Well, as happened with the ice cover. I mean, everybody was saying, "Oh, it's steady and it's going and it's melting," and suddenly, boom! It reached the turning point, and
yeah, it's one of many, right?
Greenland.
There are all these turning points out there, and one of them is the North Atlantic Ocean circulation in general. And if you go back to the IPCC report from 2008, they said, well, it's a concern that we might be slowing the North Atlantic circulation, slowing the sinking of the deep water in the northern North Atlantic off of Iceland and Scotland. And that could slow the Gulf Stream, affect climate, and do a bunch of other things. But they didn't think it would start to happen until we reached 4 or 5 degrees of global warming. It turns out that we're at now about 1.1 degrees of global warming, and the data are pretty clear that we have changed the North Atlantic circulation. It's about 15% slower than it was 3 decades ago, which is very, very worrisome. So these tipping points may or may not be out there. We think they are. Exactly when they kick in, that's a very imprecise type of science. It's a good reason to be cautious, right? Keeps the planet as cool as we can.
Caution isn't the word. I mean, we've got so many examples of this in the environment. Just the use of plastics. 50 years ago, nobody would have thought that the amount of the plastic water bottles and the polythene buckets and hula hoops and all of the other things which were so innovative could pose any type of threat. I mean,
it's just hard to imagine what humans do. Going back to the climate change roots, Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist, wrote a really nice book on carbon dioxide and what it might mean for the global climate system. He wrote it in 1896, right? So quite a while ago. And he predicted that if we were to double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that we'd warm the planet by about 1.5 to 6 degrees Celsius. The IPCC now says if we double it, we're going to warm it to about 3.5 to 4 degrees. So, he was right on. He has a larger range than we now know 126 years later. But, his mean values were right on, his calculations were right on. But then he went on and said, but I don't see any way that this could happen anytime in the next 500 to 1,000 years because we just can't burn fossil fuels that fast. Well, no, you're wrong there, Professor Arrhenius. Humans figured out how to burn fossil fuels faster than you ever could have imagined in 1896.
So they didn't. He didn't even need a computer to make those calculations, did he?
No, he didn't have one, right? No, he did it with a slide rule and paper and pencil, presumably.
And what about the current model? Because this is the question that the opponents will always use. The models are flawed. The IPCC models have been continually called into question from the very first time that somebody said you should stop making oil companies profits.
The IPCC models are pretty good. They're looking at the consensus of many models out there, and they've been pretty right on in terms of the rate of global warming. You can nitpick them a little bit here and there. The IPCC by nature is a conservative process. They came out with their AR6, the new synthesis report, first one since 2013. That came out earlier this month as well. And it's pretty scary what they say, but there are about 250 main authors, and then there are 1,800 of us who are reviewers of it, and then you had to get 96 governments to also agree to it. So the language which came through, it's a lot of people agreed to. That's a pretty conservative process, and yet it's still, they lay out the case that yes, we're at 1.1 degree of warming. If we reach 1.5, and the COP21 Paris Agreement was to try to keep the planet below 1.5 if possible, but well below 2 for sure. The IPCC says we're on target to reach 1.5 in about 8 to 10 years from now. And if 2, when we want to keep well below 2, we're on target to hit that in about 20 to 25 years. Those are the sort of temperatures where these tipping points become not certain, but ever more likely. And so you want to keep it below. And one thing I was very pleased about in the IPCC, against an inherently conservative process. In the past, I thought personally they rather downplayed methane and focused just on carbon dioxide. And for sure, carbon dioxide is the main driver of climate change, and it's the big whammy. But this latest report is much more heavy hitting on methane. And they say that of the global warming that we've observed over the last century, 0.75 degrees C is attributable to carbon dioxide, and 0.5 is attributable to methane. So sure, it's more carbon dioxide, but not by much. and they go on and say, if we reduce methane emissions, the climate responds much faster than just from carbon dioxide. And a lot of us have been saying that for quite some time. Drew Shindell has said it. I've parroted back his work and repeated it. But they say that if we are to have any chance of keeping the planet below 1.5, we should cut methane emissions globally by 45% by 2030, 8.5 years from now. And to do so, we'll shave about 0.3 of a degree off of warming by 2040 as to where else we would have warmed. So that's a real call to worry about these methane emissions. And my research suggests that natural gas industry is the biggest driver overall, the biggest increase in methane emissions over the last decade. And now we have this blue hydrogen, taking back to that, which increases methane emissions compared to even using just plain natural gas.
Well, one that comes up because of its inherent, I suppose, its inherent comic capability is the cow fart.
Yeah.
Is this a real threat, or is it
Yeah, no, it is. And there's a scientific debate, a lively debate, as to how much of the methane is coming from cows versus how much is coming from natural gas. And there are other things going on and other arguments. But I think there are multiple sources of methane, and methane's rising rapidly in the atmosphere. And many of us have been trying to figure out why. Again, my research would suggest natural gas is the biggest increase, but cows is the second biggest increase. And, they're both important sources. Other scientists would say, no, I'm wrong. And it's really more cows and less natural gas. I think most of us think it's those two. And I'm pretty sure I'm right, but nonetheless, cows are important part of it. It's not cow farts so much, though. It's cow belching. They burp it out.
Yeah, no, not as much fun, not as memorable, but
cow belching.
But that's. Is there anything that could be done there? For example, the artificial feeds that we give the cattle a contributory factor here?
Well, there's some research on that. There's not enough. Clearly, there's some relationship between what a cow eats and how much methane it belches out. The methane is formed by bacteria in the gut of the cow. There's no oxygen in the gut of cow. It's a oxygen-free environment, and you give a organic rich medium to bacteria where oxygen's not present, and they produce methane. That's what happens in wetlands. What happens in sewage treatment plants. It happens in landfills. All the same process, really. So the details of how you feed the cows matter. What you feed them, how much you feed them, and there's some literature on that. It's a little bit contradictory. There's some suggestion that you can add additives which will affect it. So some people say, well, if you add antibiotics, it'll stop the bacteria producing methane. I think that's a terrible idea.
I'm going to say yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you very much. When my arm drops off with the medication.
Yeah, no, exactly. I'm not agreeing. It's logical. I mean, it's logical in the sense that the bacteria are making it. So if you knock the bacteria back, it'll slow it down. But it's kind of a brute force and dangerous in its own right. However, there's some literature that if you add a little bit of kelp, a little bit of seaweed to the cow feed, it will actually slow the amount of methane that's released. And I'd like to see more research on that before we jump in and feed all of the cows of the world on a kelp diet. But people are starting to look more seriously at those sort of questions, and I think there are things we could do. Plus, just eating less red meat, right? That's one obvious thing to do.
One of the we have one of the few successes in the last 30, 40 years while I've been looking at the UN was the question of the fluorocarbons and the greenhouse, not greenhouse effect, the ultraviolets, the ozone hole, the ozone hole. People often get them confused. It's very confusing. Yeah, well, two separate things. The ozone layer was toxic in its own way, but there was actually international action was taken. People were scared enough. I think enough politicians thought they might get skin cancer that we actually acted on it. Right. And but that was a fairly how should we put it, fingerable source of emissions and responses. Right. Is methane too diffuse, as it were, to see if we can get that type of international action? You can monitor fluorocarbons, but you can't monitor cow belches, let alone.
Yeah, no, it's difficult. I think, well, the largest sources are the cow belching and the natural gas industry and other fossil fuels, but natural gas in particular. Again, I think it's natural gas is the number one, but there's no reason to get tied up in the scientific argument there. We should be working on both. There is a move. I mean, people globally are eating less beef now than in the past. To the extent they're eating the same amount of meat, they're switching into chicken and things like that, which are they have their own environmental issues as well, but they produce a lot less methane because their whole gut system is different. And I do think we can encourage research on these feeding operations, the feed details, and think about that. We're certainly here at Cornell. We're buying new equipment to allow us to to closely monitor cow belching and look at how it's done to feed in a way that really will play back on our farms. In terms of the
applicants for that job, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty exciting, really. I'm a minor part of the project, but I'm proud to be part of it. And,
Yeah.
but you know that the fossil fuels, we just need to move away from fossil fuels, and we know that because of carbon dioxide. We can't keep burning carbon dioxide either. Methane is one more reason to move quickly away from natural gas, and I think we can do it here in New York. I started by saying I'm on this Climate Action Council, the commission that is set up to come up with an implementation plan for the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I have a hard time with that, the CLCPA. And the CLCPA mandates that across the entire state of New York, all sectors of our economy, greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced by 40% in 8.5 years from now, by 2030, and by 85% by 2050. And there's some other things in there as well. But we can't reduce greenhouse gas emissions like that without dramatically reducing the use of fossil fuels in a short time frame, and in particular natural gas in the state. So we're supposed to come up with a draft implementation plan by December, still in the works. Love to come back and talk to you about in January, and I can tell you exactly what we came up with. But the draft plans we have call for things like, if you build a new home after 2025, just a couple of years from now, you cannot use fossil fuels to heat it. No fossil fuels in new construction. You have to use beneficial electrification with heat pumps. And for commercial buildings, we're going to give people a little bit more time, but by the late part of this decade, no fossil fuels in new commercial buildings either. And then moving into the future, the 2030s and beyond, if your gas furnace or your gas water heater or your gas stove dies, you won't be able to replace it in kind. You'll have to pull it out and switch to electricity, and we'll start dismantling the gas pipeline systems behind that as well. So fundamental change, and that's what the world needs. And I think New York may well take these sort of actions, and that takes care of the methane problem.
Well, there are some suggestions that I've seen, certainly in Britain, that the actual leakage from the gas pipe systems is a considerable element in methane and CO2 emissions.
It is. If you look at the we've the best data in the United States. There's actually been a lot more effort trying to measure it in the US, but I think it's probably similar in the UK and much of Europe. It might be worse in parts of Russia. But if you look at the US example, where we actually have the best data, on average, about 3.5% of the methane and natural gas in a well that's produced is emitted to the atmosphere unburned before it's ever gets to the consumer. And it happens all along the process. So when you start drilling for a new gas well, you're already emitting some methane because you're hitting pockets of trapped methane and things like that. And most of our natural gas in the United States is now shale gas, so high volume hydraulic fracturing to develop that. When you throw down all that liquid and fracture the rocks, a lot of it flows back to the surface just in the first couple of days to weeks or so, with a large amount of methane emitted then as well. And then you transport the gas to customers, and you have high pressure pipelines. Most of the compressors that power that high pressure are designed to purposely emit some methane, just their normal operations, not even a leak. Then if you do pipeline maintenance, you can't weld on a pipe that's full of methane, so you blow all the methane off to the air. That's it's an occasional event, but a big emission. And then finally you get into the distribution systems in an old city like New York, or I'm sure London, Boston. The gas, some of the pipelines are new, but a majority of them are 50 to 100 years old or more. And a large part of it are cast iron pipes that are butted end to end, never welded together. When they were laid down in time of the First World War, they might have had some sort of a seal between them, but no one's gone on and replaced that in the
Well, you look at the steam pipes on the streets of New York and see what leaks can be. Those old cast iron pipes.
It's the same thing, and they leak. So there are leaks there, but there's leaks and emissions all along the way. And some of my colleagues go, well, the solution to the methane problem is to replace all of those distribution pipelines. Well, astronomically expensive to dig up all of our city streets and put in new pipelines. And yeah, that would help. You still have a lot of methane emissions at the well side and the compressors and the pipeline maintenance, et cetera. And I'd rather see us phase out the natural gas and put those financial resources into the generation, renewable generation we need, the transmission, electric lines we need, the heat pumps and all that we need for heating. I mean, if you look at what just happened in New Orleans yesterday with Hurricane Ida, their power lines went down, right? And people are saying it might be a week to 3 weeks or so before they get those high tension wires back up. That's such, it's mid 20th century or even early 20th century technology. It's vulnerable to climate change. We should be building a secure, more efficient underground electrical system, which makes renewable energy work better and makes it more resilient to storms. And I'd much rather see us put our dollars into that as opposed to fixing the gas leaks for a system that we should be getting rid of within the next 15 years anyway.
Well, as a foreigner first came to America, I was amazed at the overhead power cables in the suburbs and townships. Just go north into Canada and you won't see them.
Yeah, I know.
You can tell you're in America because there's a spider's web of electric cables up in the air.
I know. I grew up with those, and so it always sort of seemed sort of normal, except I'll never forget this. Back in the 1970s, I was a graduate student in Woods Hole, the Cape Cod, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And there was a Russian, at the time, Soviet research vessel, which came and docked, and it was sort of a goodwill thing and all. And so I was given the job of showing some Russian scientists around. They'd never been to the United States before. And there I am showing them Cape Cod. It was quite an eye opener. But the thing that they commented on the most were all the wires along the road. I was so used to it until they pointed out, well, you're right. It is kind of odd.
I noticed it when I first came here, and I still notice it. And then I noticed when you went into Canada, once you're across the parallel, they disappeared. It's a miracle, Zoom. But Andrew Lee says, blue hydrogen project planners say the technology they'll use will result in far lower emission escapes than assumed in your study, which they claim is based on worst cases. And this I think this is a leading question. Should we believe them?
Well, our analysis was not based on worst analyses. We used, there are 4 parameters that go into our base model, and 4 only. One is the amount of methane that is emitted when you use natural gas. And I just went through that number, qualitatively and where it came from. And we said it's 3.5%. That's what the preponderance of the literature says. But we did a sensitivity analysis because some literature says it could be worse, some actually up to 10%, but that's an extreme. We did a sensitivity analysis from 1.5% up to 4.3%. And it really doesn't change your conclusions. If the methane emission rate goes down, then the blue hydrogen emissions go down, so do the gray hydrogen emissions, so do the natural gas emissions, and they all go down in proportion. So blue hydrogen is still a little bit better than gray hydrogen, but not by that much, and it's still worse than natural gas. And you just, there's no information in the literature to suggest that the methane emissions would be outside of what we assumed in that analysis. Another major assumption is the amount of carbon dioxide that's captured from the actual steam methane reforming process, where the methane's broken down into hydrogen and CO2. And there are only 2 commercial plants in the world that have ever tried to do this. And their emissions weren't great. They averaged it out. One of them was 78.8%, and the other one was about 82%. But we bumped them up to 85%, giving them the benefit of the doubt, and that was our baseline case. And then we for sensitivity analysis there, we said up to 90%, because when we talked to people in industry, they said, well, we can do better than we have. We can do as well as 90%. So we went with 90%, and again, our conclusion is very, very robust.
But 90% was a very optimistic assessment.
Well, it was, yeah. We gave them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. And the other carbon capture part is when you burn the actual fuel and look at carbon captures, and that's a harder carbon capture because it's, you have a flue gas, it's really, really hot air, it's moving fast. There's a lot of nitrogen around it in addition to just carbon dioxide and water vapor. So it's a harder capture. And there are a few well-documented values in literature, which has been closely monitored. Industry will tell you they can get 99.95%, but they don't show you the data behind that. What the data show is that 55% is kind of common. One plant operated up at about 75%, but most of them don't. We used 65% for that, which is again fairly optimistic. But for the sensitivity analysis, we also took that to 90%, and our conclusions are still robust. So we didn't use a worst case analysis at all. We used a somewhat optimistic analysis based on the best available data. And we did a sensitivity analysis across all reasonable assumptions, and the conclusion stands.
It sounds like you've built in preemptively defense against the lobbies.
Well, keep in mind, I mentioned that
they can pay more scientists than you.
I'm the first author on the first peer-reviewed analysis of how methane emissions might make shale gas a bad fuel, bad bridge fuel from 10 years ago. And that was a fairly cautious paper, but we got an incredible amount of pushback. At the time, ours was the first. There are now more than 1,500 papers on it, and most of them tend to say we turn out to be right, although there are papers along the way that said otherwise, certainly in the early years. I was cautious then, but I've learned to be even more cautious, and this is a very conservative, cautious paper, yeah.
Well, Simon Locke suggests problem with average global temperature increases, the global figures you might say, is that they can mask much higher local increases.
Yeah.
Is there a local effect there? The fact that particular areas are concentrated producers of fracking and methane.
Yeah, they're right. Our paper didn't deal with that, but in terms of both methane and carbon dioxide are distributed globally. So you can find there are gradients in the concentration of carbon dioxide and methane globally. The northern hemisphere has more than the southern hemisphere because we use and burn more fossil fuels in the northern hemisphere. But methane has a half-life of about 12 years in the atmosphere, so it's globally distributed fairly rapidly after it's emitted, and the climatic warming is global. But he's correct in that though the planet as a whole has warmed 1.1 degrees, more northern latitudes have warmed faster than that.
You saw with Greenland.
Yeah, exactly. And so you get that sort of play out. And I suppose I might have called it global warming, but the real concern is not the warming per se. It's with climate disruption and the disruption that happens when we change the heat balance of the planet as it's going on. So, Hurricane Ida was probably a stronger storm yesterday than it would have been without climate change, because the Gulf of Mexico waters are both warmer and deeper, more energy content in the surface waters. That's much more energy to intensify that storm. The atmosphere is a little bit warmer, so there's more moisture in there to power the storm. And we're getting, more severe droughts, more severe fires because things become drier and hotter and they burn more. So if you said 1.1 degrees, who cares? But what that means is that we are fundamentally changing the climate in a way that's pretty disruptive to human society.
I'll just give USA in 2021 with devastating fires, pollution.
Yeah, and it's
weather disruption.
It's because of climate change. There's really not any legitimate scientific debate about that anymore. We had storms and fires before, but they are worse, and we know they're worse, and we know by
only 10 years ago, was it? I think it was George W. Bush's administration went through redacting all government reports to eliminate any references to climate change and global warming. Are they still doing it, or have they sort of gently sidled out the backs?
I don't know what happened under Trump, right? Who knows? No, you can't find a reputable scientist who works in this area who doesn't agree that climate change, climate disruption is real. It's caused almost entirely by human activities. That's what the IPCC report says, mostly from our use of fossil fuels. It's mostly CO2 and methane, and it's causing these, again, the more extreme weather events and the more extreme fires. The IPCC is quite clear on that in this consensus report. Something they didn't address, but I'll point out, I have a colleague here at Cornell who's looked carefully at the agricultural production globally over time. And they teased apart the climate influence there by region and globally. And globally, agricultural production now in the last couple of years is about 20% less than it would have been absent climate change. So it's not that production's gone down, but it hasn't increased the way that it would have without that climate pushback from droughts and floods, primarily also ground level ozone pollution, which becomes worse from climate change. That's the global average, 20%. That's a big number. And it plays out worse in some areas. So if you look at Central America, I forget its exact numbers, but it's more like a 40% reduction. So we talk about the influx of refugees to the United States from people coming from Honduras and Guatemala, et cetera. Well, part of that's because their food supply systems are breaking down, and that's partly due to climate change. They're climate refugees. And these sort of consequences are going to get worse until we take care of climate change.
Some of the boosters were saying at one point that CO2 in the atmosphere would boost crop yields.
Yeah, no, it doesn't do that. I mean, individual plants, sometimes they grow a little bit more with carbon dioxide, but then they become more water limited. The carbon dioxide, the thing which controls crop productions is water availability, or floods you can't plant or they wash away, or ozone is a big issue. And ground level ozone, we want ozone in the stratosphere. You're talking about the ozone hole earlier and the chlorofluorocarbons created up there. We want ozone up high in the atmosphere. We do not want it at ground level. It's toxic to humans. It's toxic to plants. And as the planet warms, it increases ground level ozone. And actually, methane contributes to more ozone as well directly. It's a precursor in the reaction to form methane.
It is?
Yeah.
Ah, no.
It's not the only one. Other volatile organic compounds.
So what's the source of the ozone in the lower atmosphere? Is that all?
It comes from the reaction of small organic gases, including methane, with nitrogen oxides, and then sunlight reacts to form the ozone. If you take away the nitrogen pollution or the methane and other organic stuff or the sunlight, you'll take away the ozone. But we need sunlight for the crops too. So let's worry about the methane and the nitrous oxides.
It's like living on the top floor of a house of cards, isn't it?
Yeah. As a scientist who's spent my life working on this, it can be a little depressing and discouraging sometimes. I'm not crying here, by the way.
I was going to say, yeah, please.
I've got seasonal allergies too.
Method acting. But yes,
my eyes are itchy as hell. Sorry.
Well, another sign of the times. It's let's see. Impact of Soundlock wants to know, can you give more detail about the data on the impact of reducing methane on global warming? So, I mean, is there a one-to-one? If we do X, will Y be the result?
Yeah, there's a really excellent report that the United Nations Environmental Program put out in May, and it's discussed somewhat in the IPCC report that just came out this month, but it's in more detail in the May UNEP report, because the IPCC was taking years to do it, and UNEP is faster. But anyway, the UNEP report clearly says that if they say that we can, that the society has the ability to reduce methane emissions by 40 to 45% in the next 8.5 years, mostly from animal agriculture and from fossil fuels. And that if we were to do that it would immediately slow the rate of global warming, and it would trim 0.3 of a degree or more off of the rate of warming that we would otherwise observe by 2040. So there's a little bit of a lag there, but not much. And that's a significant, again. So we're at 1.1, we're talking about shaving, and we want to keep below 1.5. That's just 0.4. 0.3 of that we can shave off by reducing our methane emissions.
This is a political as well as a scientific question, isn't it? I mean, how can people be persuaded to take the necessary action, especially if it hits people's, if it hits companies' bottom lines?
Yeah, all I can say is that I try to keep my optimism up, because I think 10 years ago, I and others were talking about we needed to move to 100% decarbonized energy future. And I thought it was possible, but it seemed like a heavy lift, right? Today, it seems like much less of a heavy lift. So, for this Climate Action Council and our New York law, again, we don't have the final implementation plans. We're working on those, but we have advisory panels on emissions from housing and buildings, and we have an advisory panel on the electric production side of things, and they've put a lot of effort into it. So, they believe that we can relatively easily by 2030 reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from our electricity production in New York by 70%, 70, compared to where we were in 1990. We're halfway there already, just because that's the way the economy's been moving things. And we're moving towards more renewables, but the ability is there, and it's cost effective. It's not going to break the state to do that. In terms of the degasifying, defossil fueling homes and all, for new home construction, that's cost effective too. Right now, if you build a new home in New York, and I think it's probably true in most states, but it's by law in New York, if you live near a gas distribution pipeline, the gas company by law has to, at their expense, connect you to that. That's on average a $30,000 subsidy per new home that the gas company is paying. And of course, they get it back from you and all other ratepayers over time, so they make money off of that too. But that's, if you cut away that $30,000 subsidy and instead put in a high efficiency heat pump, which extracts energy from the environment and uses just a modest amount of electricity to do that, the homeowner, the initial cost of the house is actually less, and the operating costs are less. So it is good for homeowners. It's also good for the electric utility, by the way, and it's good for the people who put in heat pumps. The only losers in that are the natural gas industry. So there will be some losers as we do this, but sometimes you hear these projections that's just going to be devastating for society and for the average person, and I don't think that's true.
It's one thing in the suburbs or the exurbs to drill down and take advantage of the high of the of the thermal energy gaps in the soil. I'm on the 9th floor of a Manhattan apartment block. Where do I sink my thermocouples?
Yeah, well, New York City is more of a challenge for heating, for sure, right? But
it has efficiencies of scale to match.
It does, exactly. And New York per capita energy consumption and the per capita greenhouse gas emissions for those of you living in New York are the lowest in the United States. By far, they're on a par with better European cities, and no other city and no rural area in the U.S. comes close to that. So that's an economy of scale. A lot of that's transportation. The metro system, works. We can make it better, and put electric buses and things out there. We should be doing more. The heating in New York City is going to be a challenge, but you can do it. And a lot of it, I think, is perhaps better seasonal storage and day-to-day storage of heating. So, I don't spend a lot of time in New York, but I've been in New York, and sometimes in conferences with fancy LEED Silver certified buildings. They're still not energy efficient, right? It gets hot because you're there in January, and it gets hot because the sun's coming in the window and people are opening all the windows in January. So you don't have to do that. We can develop ways so that when it's 2 p.m. and hot in that room because the sun's coming in the window, you store that thermal energy and you release it back at 3 a.m. when you need it. That's easy technology to do, and that could be retrofitted to, I think, a lot of the structures in New York City.
I have that problem, but I don't have enough space for the storage batteries.
Well, I know. So, there's challenges to be worked out.
The pluses and minuses in it.
But nonetheless, there are a lot of creative people in the world. Let's get them thinking about these challenges. How do you do that sort of storage cost effectively and space effectively in buildings such as yours? I'm not an engineer, but I'm confident that if you put people to work on it, they'd figure out how to do it.
Well, similar in New York, there's been a move to take out gas for cooking.
Right.
And that's not environmental. Well, it is environmental, because if the apartment block blows up, as several have done, that's quite a bad environment.
And yes, that's leaking methane on its way to your apartment. But yeah, no, I mean, the indoor air quality goes up a lot when you get rid of something that's openly burning fuel in your home. That's a polluting source. So And we now have, these fantastic induction top stoves that work incredibly well, very, very energy efficient, and they're very, very quick to respond. I mean, people used to say I didn't want to use a electric stove because I'm a great cook and the gas gives me more control, but these magnetic induction stoves give you every bit as much control without the air pollution.
I'll have to consider that one. Do we have any more questions out there, people? Right. Andrew Lee, what's your opinion on the use of nuclear energy to produce hydrogen? Is that green hydrogen, purple hydrogen? I mean, which part of the spectrum is nuclear produced?
That's a great question. Well, let me back up just a little bit and tell you what I think about nuclear power in general, because I've been getting attacked by some pro-nuclear forces on Twitter over what I think. So let me be really clear. I don't think that building nuclear power plants is a good idea moving forward in terms of energy policy or climate change. They're expensive to build, they are slow to deploy, and we can put renewable energy and renewable energy storage in place for far less cost and far more quickly. So we should just plain do it. On top of that, nuclear power, you have the issues associated with
long-term storage.
Long-term storage and dangers, yeah, sure. And so it's another reason not to do it. So I don't think we should be building any new plants. What do you do with existing plants? The state closed the Indian Point plants just north of you there earlier this year, and that certainly is going to increase our short-term greenhouse gas emissions. Although I think it's a blip, we're still going to be able to go to fossil fuel free electricity production fairly quickly in New York.
I think Fukuyama suggested it wasn't a good idea to build nuclear power plants next to tidal rivers during a time of climate change.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so close to such a major city and close to faults and things, it never struck me as a wise idea. But we still have a couple of nuclear plants in New York, say here in upstate, Oswego and Lake Ontario has a couple of plants. And, I think it's okay to keep those operating as long as they are safe and it's within their design life, as long as it doesn't take a huge subsidy. And at the moment, actually, we are subsidizing them pretty heavily. So maybe we should shut them down too and take those billions of dollars and put it into other things. But I'm not, in general, one who says we should just be shutting down the existing plants willy-nilly. It should be a thoughtful process, but I'm solidly opposed to building new ones. As to the hydrogen generation from nuclear, I haven't thought about deeply. I first heard of that as an idea only in the last couple of days, and I haven't had time to look into it. So I don't know if they're talking about this as a byproduct of what they're doing anyway, or if it's instead of feeding electricity to the grid. And if it's the latter, it's probably a bad idea. We're better off with the electricity. If it's the former, and you're
surely one of the points with nuclear power is it, basically you have the sunken costs on a continuous generation capacity,
right?
Rather than the peaks and lows that other plants use. So
yeah, no, that's definitely true.
Turn out the electricity, you may as well use it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Although it's it's pretty expensive electricity too. So, but anyway, I'm not knowledgeable enough to comment in detail on making hydrogen from them. But I don't see it as a long-term solution because I don't see nukes as if there are nuclear plants in the world 30 years from now, I'd be surprised.
Well, I've done business stories on the nuclear generation industry, and as far as I can tell, none of them ever make money without massive government subsidies and debt forgiveness. And many of them, as we know, are as we're accusing the Iranians, are really deep cover for making bombs.
Which is another reason to get rid of them. If no country is using the peaceful atom, then it's harder to have the other atom, right? So, I grew up in the 1950s, 1960s, and I remember as a grade school student, we were told about how nuclear power was going to be so cheap, be free. Basically, it was the future. It's a wonderful world of free energy because of nuclear power and the peaceful atoms there. It's never really come about.
That was next to the domestic science class where they said there'll be pie in the sky by
probably, yeah, right.
It's up there. Right, do we have any other questions? We are getting towards the end. And well, nobody's stepping up to the plate at the moment. But I have to say, this has been an interesting discussion on the ramifications. I mean, we've got a lot in here. We've got the full spectrum hydrogen from blue, green, gray, brown, purple, which we just introduced, and many others. And no, I sometimes think if you want to start a scare story, remember the Hindenburg was filled with hydrogen.
That's true.
Play their tricks back on them.
Good point.
H for Hindenburg. Watch it flow.
Good point.
Cheap, clean energy all over the New Jersey skyline.
Set back glimpse for a while, didn't it?
Yes. Helium doesn't burn, does it? But that's another story.
Oh, it's another story.
Yeah.
Helium's co-produced with natural gas, and once we cut out natural gas, the world supply of helium is going to go downhill too.
It is? Oh,
Yeah.
there were caverns down in New Mexico or somewhere filled with stuff.
Maybe, we'll see.
So look, thank you very much. This has been an interesting discussion.
I've enjoyed chatting with you.
This is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association in New York, and would like to invite you on Thursday. Caitlin, put it up, please. Thursday at 10:30, we have Shashi Tharoor, an old friend who is an accomplished novelist, was in the foreign ministry in India, was in the United Nations, and distinguished, very articulate, and suffered COVID at the height of the epidemic in Delhi. We're supposed to have him, but we're much better here than on the burning ghats, as it were. And coming up next week, we have Ambassador Michael McFaul with the Ambassadorial Roundtable on Biden, Russia, and China. It sounds continuing the apocalyptic theme, all bets are off. And September the 9th, a sort of future history of what's been passed. Tom Osborne, former colleague from the UN, from I think CBC, I've forgotten, with Peter Jennings, his decade with Peter Jennings, who was Canadian, of course, so he was actually much more attuned to foreign correspondence from the US than many Americans. So look out for these. Do join the Foreign Press Association. Do look up our sites to see what we're offering. Do go to the YouTube afterwards and tell your friends about it. And also look up the papers from the good Dr. Howarth here and watch your natural gas use and watch how you belp in future. Remember. Okay, thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.